The wind carried dust across the yard, stinging her bare skin like 1,000 needles. Clara Whitfield stood in the center of her dead husband's ranch, her arms wrapped tightly over herself, while the coarse laughter of the Whitfield clan scraped against her ears. They had taken everything, her home, her safety, and now even the last thread of her dignity. The men lounged against the corral, their spurs clinking as they shifted, and the women, her late husband's sisters, watched with thin, cruel smiles, their satisfaction colder than any desert night. She felt the grit of dirt in her teeth, tasted humiliation on her tongue, and yet she would not give them the pleasure of seeing her collapse. One of them, her brother-in-law Hiram, spat into the dust and sneered. What good's a widow with no boy to carry the Whitfield name? Useless as a lame horse. You're finished here, Clara. His words cut sharper than the knife at his hip. Another voice chimed in, a woman's, mocking, maybe someone passing by will take pity. Or maybe you'll find yourself coyote feed before sundown. Laughter rang again, hollow and merciless, like boots stamping out the last embers of a fire. Clara tried to steady her breath, but her chest heaved with the weight of grief and rage. Only months ago she had stood on this very ground as a bride, filled with pride and hope. Her husband, Daniel, had sworn to protect her, to build a life from the soil. Now he was gone, buried without justice, his family circling like vultures. She had begged them for mercy, for a roof, for the simplest scrap of humanity. Instead, they stripped her of cloth and honor, leaving her trembling in the open as if she were nothing more than a discarded carcass. The sun glared above, unrelenting, baking the earth and her shame into one unbearable memory. Her legs threatened to give way, but she clenched her jaw and straightened her spine. They would not see her break. They would not see her tears. Inside her, a flame flickered, fragile but stubborn. Yet even that spark quavered when the men began to step closer, boots crunching in deliberate rhythm, their shadows stretching over her. Then came a silence. Not the silence of mercy, but one that shifted the air, heavier, colder, charged with a tension that made the Whitfields glance up from their cruelty. Clara's breath caught as a tall figure emerged from the far edge of the yard. He moved with the ease of someone who belonged to no one but the land itself, a long coat brushing the dust, a battered hat pulled low over his brow. His face bore scars, his eyes the hard glint of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by cruelty. He stopped just a few feet away, his gaze fixed not on her shame, but on the men who had forced it. Without a word, he shrugged off his coat and swung it over her shoulders. The weight of it startled her, the smell of leather, horse, and smoke filled her nose, steadying her trembling body. The laughter faltered. "You're coming with me," the man said, his voice low and steady, carrying more weight than a dozen shouted threats. For a moment, no one moved. Then Hiram chuckled, a dry, ugly sound. "Well now, Boone, didn't think you had it in you. Thought you'd buried yourself up in those canyons for good. A broken man playing savior? You'll be dead before the week's out if you think you can stand against us." The man, Elias Boone, Clara recalled the name, whispered in town with equal parts pity and respect, didn't flinch. His hand rested near the revolver at his hip, not drawing, not boasting, only promising. His eyes never left the Whitfields, but Clara felt the shield of his presence settle around her like another layer of his coat. She wanted to speak, to protest, to tell him she could not bear another man deciding her fate. But the words clung to her throat. Instead, she found herself watching the tight line of his jaw, the steady patience in his stance. This was not pity. This was defiance, aimed not at her, but at those who had broken her down. The Whitfields muttered among themselves, their cruelty shifting to unease. One of the women hissed, "She's nothing but trouble, Boone. Let her rot. Best for everyone." "Best for you," Elias replied, his voice a blade drawn slow and sure. The silence stretched. Clara's heart thudded in her chest as she realized the choice before her. Stay, endure further torment, or take the hand of a man as much stranger as savior. Then Elias moved, not toward the Whitfields, but toward the horse tethered by the well. He held out a calloused hand for her to follow. Her feet felt rooted to the earth. If she left, there was no turning back. No family, no shelter, only the unknown with a man whose eyes carried storms. Yet when she looked back at her in-laws, their smirks returned, promises of further humiliation in their eyes. She knew the answer. She gathered the coat tighter around her and stepped toward Elias. The moment her foot lifted from the dust, a gunshot cracked through the air. The sound split the silence, echoing off the hills. Clara flinched, gasping, but Elias was already between her and the Whitfields, his revolver drawn in a blur of motion. No smoke rose from their side, only a warning shot, fired high into the sky, a reminder of power. Elias's voice thundered across the yard. "Next shot won't miss." The Whitfield sneered, spat, but none advanced. One muttered, "She ain't worth dying for." Another added, "You'll regret this, Boone." Yet their boots scuffed backward, their laughter forced now, brittle as cracked glass. Elias holstered his revolver and helped Clara onto his horse, the leather creaking under her weight. She clung to him, the coat slipping as her arms tightened around his waist. The animal shifted, hooves pouring the dust, eager to run. The ranch fell away behind them as they thundered into the desert night, the wind tearing at Clara's hair, the stars wheeling above in their endless silence. She pressed her face into Elias's shoulder, half from fear, half from the need to hide the tears that finally broke free. For the first time in months, someone had stood between her and cruelty. Yet safety was far from certain. The Whitfields were not the kind to surrender, and she knew vengeance had already been seeded in their hearts. Still, as the dark swallowed the land behind them, Clara whispered, her voice trembling but unbroken, "Why would you risk your life for me?" Elias's reply came quiet, almost lost to the pounding hooves, "Because I know what it's like to be left with nothing." And the desert stretched on, endless and unforgiving, carrying them both into a future neither could yet see. The ride to Elias Boone's homestead seemed longer than a night should hold. The horse's stride pounded against Clara's body until her bones ached, but she did not loosen her grip. She could feel the rhythm of his breathing beneath her cheek, steady as a drumbeat, unshaken even as shadows shifted around them. The desert night was merciless, sharp air biting at her skin beneath the coat he had given her. The scent of leather and sage lingered in every breath. Each mile carried her farther from the Whitfields, yet not far enough from the memory of their laughter. When at last Elias reined the horse to a halt, dawn's first light painted the horizon with strokes of pale gold. Clara lifted her head and saw his home, if one could call it that. A cabin of raw timber crouched against the red cliffs, half hidden by mesquite and weather-worn rock. Fences sagged where cattle once roamed, and the roof bore the scars of storms. It looked more like a fortress of solitude than a dwelling, as if it had grown from the land itself. Elias swung down and offered his hand. She hesitated before taking it, her palm cold against his rough grip. He said nothing, only led her toward the door. Inside smelled of wood smoke, iron, and a loneliness that clung to the air as tangibly as dust. The furniture was spare, a rough-hewn table, a bed in the corner, shelves lined with tools, ammunition, and jars of dried beans. No woman's touch softened the space, no laughter echoed in the walls. Clara pulled the coat tighter. "You live alone out here." Elias struck a match and lit the small lamp on the table. Its glow caught the lines on his face, shadows carving them deeper. "Alone's easier." He turned away, busying himself with the kettle as though her question required no more answer. She studied him, the way his shoulders carried weight even when still, the scar that traced from his cheekbone into his beard. A man built for silence. Yet in that silence, she caught echoes of sorrow, unspoken but heavy. He set the kettle over the fire and leaned against the table. "There's beans and bread, if you're hungry." Her stomach twisted at the thought of food, but she nodded. The taste of dry bread and bitter coffee filled her mouth moments later, grounding her. Hunger, at least, did not wait for grief. As she ate, the events of the night returned in sharp fragments, the jeers, the shame, the sudden crack of gunfire, and this man standing between her and ruin. Gratitude pulsed in her chest, but so did unease. No one did something for nothing. "What do you want from me?" The words escaped before she could soften them. Elias's eyes met hers, steady as stone. "Nothing you don't want to give." He took a slow sip of coffee, gaze never breaking. "I pulled you out because no one else would. That's all." Clara swallowed, her throat dry. Part of her wanted to believe him, yet another part remembered every promise ever broken by a man's tongue. Still, his words held no polish, no pretense. They were simple, blunt, almost weary. The hours stretched into day. Sunlight slanted through the window, laying bars of gold across the floor. Clara moved through the cabin with cautious steps, tracing the edges of a life reduced to survival. She found bullet holes in the wall near the door, scars of battles fought on this soil. A rifle rested within reach of the table, its wood polished by use. She turned to him. "They'll come after me." "They'll try." He checked the rifle with calm hands, loading cartridges as if preparing for an inevitability rather than a possibility. "And you," she pressed. "Why take that risk?" Elias paused. His jaw tightened, but he gave no answer. Instead, He carried the rifle outside and began stacking wood by the fence. His silence told her more than any speech. This was a man who had once risked much and lost more. The day passed in slow labor. Clara gathered water from the well, her hands raw from the rope. She swept dust from the cabin floor, though it only stirred back in. Elias worked on repairing a broken corral rail, each swing of his hammer punctuating the silence. Occasionally, their eyes met, not with warmth, but with a recognition that survival left little room for softness. By evening, fatigue weighed on her limbs. She sank onto the porch step, watching the desert bleed into twilight. Elias joined her, setting a tin cup of water by her hand. Coyotes howled somewhere in the distance. "They won't let me go," she said, her voice almost swallowed by the wind. Elias stared out at the horizon, where the sky burned red. "Then you'll have to learn not to be taken." Her brows drew tight. "I've never shot a gun. Never fought back." His tone wasn't mocking, only factual. He turned to her, eyes sharp but not unkind. "You will. If you stay alive, you will." Clara lowered her gaze to her hands, pale and trembling in her lap. The memory of Hiram's smirk burned in her mind. She clenched her fists until her nails bit her skin. "Then teach me." For the first time, something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the faintest ghost of it, as though he respected the demand. He rose and disappeared inside, returning with a revolver, its weight heavy in his palm. He placed it gently in her hands. "First lesson, don't fear its weight. Fear hesitating to use it." She swallowed hard, the cold steel foreign against her skin. He guided her outside, setting bottles atop a rail. The desert air smelled of dust and sage, the light dimming into indigo. "Hold it steady. Breathe with it," he instructed. His hand rested briefly over hers, steadying her grip, then withdrew. The first shot cracked loud enough to jolt her heart. The bullet missed wide, echoing off the rocks. Elias didn't scold. Again. She fired, missed again. Her ears rang, hands shook, but stubbornness rooted her in place. By the fifth shot, the bottle shattered into dust and shards. Clara gasped, half from the noise, half from disbelief. Elias's gaze lingered on her, unreadable, before he nodded once. "Good." Something stirred in her chest, fragile but fierce, the tiniest thread of power she had thought stripped from her forever. Night deepened, stars crowding the sky. Inside the cabin, she lay on a bed of blankets, listening to the fire crackle. Exhaustion pulled at her, but sleep did not come easily. She turned to the shadows where Elias sat cleaning his rifle. "Why me?" she whispered into the dim. He didn't look up. His voice was quiet, yet it carried through the stillness. "Because you remind me of someone I couldn't save." The word struck her like a sudden gust, chilling, sorrowful, heavy with ghosts she did not yet know. She wanted to ask more, but the weight in his tone closed the door. Her eyes drifted shut at last, though unease lingered. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying faint hoofbeats across the canyon, distant but real. She stirred, unsure if it was dream or warning. And in that thin place between wakefulness and sleep, she felt the truth settle over her. Safety was temporary. The Whitfields were coming, and the only thing standing between her and them was a man haunted by his own unfinished war. The morning came too still, the kind of silence that pressed against the skin like a warning. Clara stepped onto the porch, the revolver Elias had given her hanging at her side. Her eyes swept the canyon beyond the fence. The desert seemed empty, but unease clawed at her chest. The faint sound she had half-dreamed the night before returned, hoofbeats rolling in the distance, faint as thunder too far away to touch but close enough to promise a storm. She called his name, her voice low, careful not to carry. Elias emerged from the corral, sweat streaking his brow, a coil of rope in his hand. His gaze followed hers to the horizon. He didn't speak, but the shift in his stance said enough. He dropped the rope, strode past her into the cabin, and returned with the rifle already loaded. "Inside," he ordered. Her pride rose up in protest, but the flint in his voice left no room for defiance. She stepped back, gripping the revolver tighter, her stomach knotting as dust began to swell along the horizon. The riders appeared, a cluster of dark figures cutting across the pale sand, their pace swift, their direction certain. Her heart pounded, each beat drumming into her throat. She remembered Elias's words, "Don't fear its weight. Fear hesitating to use it." She whispered them now, steadying her breath as she backed into the shadow of the cabin. The riders fanned out when they reached the yard, their horses snorting, stamping. At their head sat Hiram, his face a sneer carved in stone. His voice rang out, smug and venomous. "Boone! You think stealing what's ours makes her yours? She's Whitfield property, and you'll die for forgetting it." Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle balanced easy in his hands. His expression gave nothing away. "She's no one's property." Laughter rippled through the men. Clara's nails dug into her palms, fury sparking against the memory of their hands tearing at her clothes, their jeers slicing into her dignity. The thought of being dragged back under their grip filled her with such raw terror it burned. She raised the revolver, breath sharp. The first gunshot shattered the morning calm. Clara didn't know who fired it, but the air erupted into chaos. Horses reared, bullets tore splinters from the cabin wall. Elias's rifle barked back, each shot precise, calculated. Clara crouched behind the doorframe, heart slamming, the revolver heavy and shaking in her grasp. A shadow darted at the window, a flash of steel raised high. Without thinking, she aimed and squeezed. The explosion of sound stunned her, the recoil jarring through her arms. The man outside cried out, stumbling back, clutching his arm. Her chest heaved, disbelief warring with horror. She had hit him. "Reload," Elias barked, ducking as a bullet whined past his head. She fumbled with trembling fingers, nearly dropping the cartridges, but forced herself to steady, to move faster. The fight raged like a storm battering wood and flesh. Smoke thickened, mingling with the acrid tang of powder. Elias moved with a grim grace, his rifle never wasting a bullet. Yet the Whitfields pressed hard, anger fueling their charge. Clara caught sight of Hiram circling wide, his eyes fixed on the cabin door. He dismounted with the grace of a predator, slipping into the shadows. Her blood froze. She turned, revolver raised, as the door burst inward. Hiram filled the frame, his grin sharp, eyes burning with triumph. "Thought you could hide behind Boone? You'll crawl back, same as before." He advanced, pistol gleaming in his fist. Clara's hand shook, her breath ragged. She backed away until her shoulders hit the wall, nowhere left to retreat. His laughter curdled her veins. "Go on," he taunted, stepping closer. "Shoot me, little widow. We both know you won't." Her pulse thundered, her vision narrowing until only his sneering face remained. Something inside her snapped, not a break, but a hardening. The memory of standing in the dirt, stripped, humiliated, seared through her. She lifted the revolver, both hands gripping tight, and fired. The blast roared in the cabin. Hiram staggered, shock etched across his face before his knees buckled and he crashed to the floor. Smoke curled upward, the silence after deafening. Clara's ears rang, her chest heaved, her hands refused to lower the weapon even as the man lay still at her feet. Elias burst through the doorway a heartbeat later, his rifle raised. His gaze flicked from her pale face to the fallen man, and he lowered the weapon slowly. "You did what you had to." His words carried no judgment, only a solemn recognition. Clara's throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She wanted to scream, to collapse, to vomit, but instead she stood frozen, the revolver heavy in her grip. A part of her waited for shame to wash over, but what came instead was something harder, sharper, a certainty that she had crossed a line and could never return. Outside, the battle faltered. The Whitfield men, seeing their leader fallen, shouted in fury, but their shots grew wild, desperate. Elias fired again, each crack of his rifle driving them back. At last, one by one, the riders pulled away, retreating into the dust, curses trailing behind them like a bitter wind. Silence reclaimed the yard. Smoke curled from the cabin walls where bullets had pierced the wood. Clara's hands finally loosened, the revolver slipping to the floor with a dull thud. She stared at it, the echo of the shot still alive in her bones. Elias stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "They'll be back," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Yes," he answered, his eyes fixed on the horizon, jaw set like stone. "And next time, they'll bring more men." Her breath hitched, fear twisting with something else, resolve. The line had been drawn. There was no going back to the woman who once begged for mercy in the dust. She had fired. She had stood. And though the weight of it threatened to crush her, it also lit a fire she could not ignore. The cabin walls bore scars of the fight, the ground outside stained with the morning's violence. But within Clara's chest, a different mark had been carved, an awakening she had not sought but could no longer deny. She met Elias's gaze, her voice low but steady. "Then we'll be ready." He nodded, the faintest glimmer of respect breaking through the hardness in his eyes. Outside, the desert stretched wide and merciless, promising no rest, no forgiveness. And somewhere beyond the horizon, vengeance gathered itself again. The days that followed carried a weight sharper than any bullet. The cabin smelled of smoke and iron, a reminder of the fight that had nearly shattered it. Clara moved through the silence like a shadow, her body weary, her spirit pulled taut, but her eyes, once dulled by grief, now held a simmering fire. Elias watched her from a distance, his own silence unbroken, though she sensed the shift in him. He no longer looked at her as though she might shatter. He looked at her as though she had already survived the breaking. He began teaching her without asking if she wanted more lessons. At dawn, he led her into the canyon where the air was cool and the sun touched only the ridges. He set tin cans along a fence, his voice steady, calm, instructing her on stance, on breathing, on the patience of waiting for a clean shot. Her hands blistered, her shoulders burned, but she did not complain. Each shattered can fed something inside her, a resolve that had been denied too long. At night, she learned other things. How to read the stars for direction. How to gather wood that burned slow through the coldest hours. How to listen for hoofbeats hidden beneath the cries of coyotes. Elias was patient, not gentle, his lessons shaped by the truth that hesitation meant death. Sometimes, when he caught her eyes holding steady on him, he would look away quickly, as if afraid she might see too much of the ghosts behind his own gaze. Clara found herself laughing once, unexpectedly, when she burned a skillet of beans beyond recognition. The smoke filled the cabin, her coughing uncontrollable, and Elias, grumbling, shoved the pan outside. His muttered curse about city women and their fancy ways of ruining food drew laughter from her throat so sudden it startled them both. The sound felt foreign, as if it belonged to another life, but it clung to her lips long after. Yet beneath these small moments of strange comfort lay the constant knowledge that vengeance was not finished. The Whitfields had tasted humiliation, and men like that did not forgive. Elias sharpened his blades, cleaned his rifle with ritual precision, and built barricades around the yard. Clara stitched patches over the holes in the cabin walls, her fingers trembling not from the needle but from the certainty that another storm was building. The morning it came, the sky was a bruised grey, heavy with clouds that threatened rain but offered none. Clara woke to the sound of hoofbeats, not a dream this time, but a reality that shook the earth. Dust rose beyond the canyon mouth, thicker, heavier. Twice as many riders as before. She stood at the window, heart hammering, and whispered to herself the words Elias had given her, "Don't fear its weight. Fear hesitating to use it. Elias strapped his revolver across his hip, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and handed her a second pistol. His eyes locked on hers. "Stay behind cover. Don't waste bullets. If you fall, you stand again. Understand?" She nodded, though her mouth was dry as ash. The fire inside her burned against the flood of fear, and she clung to it as if it were the only rope keeping her from drowning. The riders thundered into the yard, their shouts tearing through the air. At their front rode the patriarch himself, old Samuel Whitfield, his beard white but his eyes sharp with venom. He raised his hand, halting the men, and called out with a voice that carried like a sermon. "Boone! You've meddled in Whitfield blood, and you'll pay for it. Send the girl out, and maybe we'll let you crawl away with your life." Elias's voice cut through the wind, unflinching. "She's no girl. She's free. And you'll leave here with less than you came." The first shot came like lightning. The yard erupted into gunfire, smoke coiling, horses screaming. Clara crouched behind the porch rail, firing into the haze, her arms steady in a way they had never been before. Each pull of the trigger shook her bones, but each strike of lead against wood or flesh carried a message: she would not be owned again. Elias moved with ruthless efficiency, his rifle an extension of his body. Men fell, horses scattered, yet more pressed forward, the Whitfield name a poison urging them on. Clara's pistol clicked empty. Her hand scrambled for the second, her breath ragged, her pulse wild. A figure burst through the smoke, rushing her with a knife. She fired, the man collapsing feet from her, his blade clattering into the dust. Her body shook, but her eyes stayed fixed forward. The battle roared on, the yard transforming into chaos, until Clara saw Samuel Whitfield himself dismount, moving through the smoke like a viper. His pistol raised, his gaze locked on her. Every memory of humiliation returned, the sting of his command, the certainty of his ownership. For a heartbeat, fear threatened to root her in place. But then she remembered the taste of dust, the sound of Elias's voice, the crack of her own gun in the cabin when she had killed Hiram. She raised her revolver. The shot rang out, loud, final. Samuel staggered, disbelief flashing across his face before he crumpled into the dirt. Silence rippled outward, a stunned pause that seemed to suck the air from the world. The Whitfield men faltered, their courage unraveling. One by one, they turned their horses, retreating into the dust, their shouts breaking apart into desperate curses. When the last rider disappeared beyond the ridge, Clara lowered the revolver, her arms trembling, her knees weak. She sank into the dirt, the weapon slipping from her grasp. Her body wanted to collapse, but her spirit stood taller than it ever had. Elias strode to her side, his hand firm on her shoulder, steadying her as though she had been carrying the weight of the whole battle. "You did it," he said, his voice rough, but beneath it lay a quiet reverence. Her eyes lifted to his, filled with tears not of weakness but of release. "No," she whispered. "We did." They stood in the ruined yard, smoke curling around them, bullet holes marking the cabin, the ground littered with reminders of violence. Yet in that desolation, something new had been forged. Clara was no longer the widow stripped in the dirt. She was something harder, stronger, unyielding. And Elias, haunted by his own losses, found in her not just someone to save, but someone to stand beside. As night fell, the desert quieted again, stars spreading across the sky in endless witness. Clara sat on the porch steps, the revolver resting by her side, no longer foreign in her hand. Elias sat beside her, silent as always, but his presence no longer felt distant. It felt like an anchor. The narrator's voice seemed to rise from the silence, speaking not only of her story but of the truth hidden in all who listened. Out here, survival was not just about bullets and blood, but about reclaiming the dignity that others tried to strip away. Clara had found her strength, Elias his reason, and together they carved meaning from the wilderness. And perhaps, the voice suggested, the lesson was not theirs alone. If this story moved you, it urged, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.